Okay there, welcome to this revision video which explains how to answer Eilzabethans, the 20-mark essay question 8 and 9. So we're just going to start off just by going through some steps for success for this question. So the first thing to do is to decode the question, so be really clear on what it's asking you to do and make sure you're linking back to the question in your answer. For the Eilzabethans question, it's worth 20 marks rather than the normal 18 marks. And that's partly because they give you a historical interpretation to actually look at. So therefore, it's a little bit more complicated, the question to do. And therefore, you do need to really make sure that you decode the question properly and you're really clear on what it's asking you to do. Make a quick plan. You're looking for 4 developed arguments with a degree of balance. Then you'll need, within your answer, 4 well-explained paragraphs. Each paragraph must include detailed and specific knowledge, analysis and explanation, and that's linking to your second order concepts, and then linking back to the question. And then the last step is to finish with a conclusion, which we call a clinching argument. Now, the essay question's worth 20 marks, so you should spend about 25 minutes on it in the actual exam. In terms of the mark scheme, there are 5 levels to go through. So level 1 to 4 marks is when you make sort of valid but general statements. So you're sort of quite vague in your knowledge. You might identify a few arguments linked to the question, but they're not really fully explained. Level 2 is 1 developed argument. That's 5 to 8 marks. So if you only have like 1 really good paragraph, then you're going to get between 5 and 8 marks. Level 3 is 9 to 12 marks. That's 2 developed arguments. Level 4 is 3 developed arguments, but it must be balanced. So you must have, say, 2 agree, 1 disagree, for example. And then level 5, which you'll be going for, is 4 developed arguments plus a clinching argument, which is your conclusion. And that obviously must be balanced as well. Okay, so we're going to start off by decoding the exam question. Now, it's worth saying that in the Eilzabethans exam, you'll have a choice of either a question 8 or question 9 to do. So you need to read both questions carefully and then choose which question will be the easiest for you to do well on. So which you've revised the best, which you feel most confident on, always go for that question. So we're actually just going to just look at one question today. So this is a 20-mark question, question 8 from a past exam. And it says, according to the website of the Historical Association, Elizabethan views towards the poor were compassionate towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. How far do you agree with this view of Eilzabethan responses towards the poor between 1580 and 1603? So you can see here the question is quite long, so it's really, really important to break down the question so that you know exactly what you need to do before tackling it. So decoding the exam question is really, really important for the 20-mark Eilzabethans essay. They give you the view of a historian, so you need to begin by working out what the view of the historian is. So you can see here I've highlighted some things on the question, and the first thing I've highlighted here is Elizabethan views towards the poor were compassionate towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. So that's the view that you're being asked to look at. And as with all of these longer essay questions, you need to find evidence which both agrees with that interpretation and disagrees. So when it says here, for example, as well, if you look in the bottom left, how far do you agree means that you need to look at evidence to agree and disagree with the interpretation. And when it says also about Elizabethan responses, that's actually really worth looking at because that's quite broad. So within this question, you can look at sort of the role of the national government, you can look at local government, and also the attitudes of just maybe ordinary people towards the poor during this time. Now, you want to break down the use of the word compassionate as well. So compassionate means that people have more sympathy, they're prepared to do more to help people towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. So you really need to think about what evidence you've learned about what kind of attitudes people had towards the poor during Elizabeth's reign in order to tackle this question successfully. So in terms of the structure of this answer, you don't need to have an introduction to your answer. You won't get any marks for that. So you need to have your 4 developed arguments. Remember, a developed argument is specific and relevant knowledge, analysis and explanation using relevant second order concepts and good historical language, and a clear link back to the question. So, you want to be using phrases in your answer like, this shows that the Eilzabethans were compassionate towards the poor because, or this shows that Eilzabethans were not compassionate towards the poor because. So that's how you structure your answer. Now, it can be really useful to make a quick plan, but it does need to be a really quick plan, but that can just help with your initial thinking. So before you start your essay, you should have like a good awareness of what you're actually going to be writing about within your essay so that you know exactly what you are going to be doing within your answer. So let's just have a look at one way of doing this. So in terms of structuring your answer, you need to obviously make sure you include information from the correct time period. Include precise and relevant knowledge. So it's really important that you've got that specific knowledge. So it's like a key date, a key event, a key individual, a key example, a key statistic, something like that. Going to link to the correct second order concept. So this one is sort of very much evaluating an interpretation, looking at sort of similarity and difference, also a little bit of consequence in there as well. The essays don't always perfectly fit into just one second order concept, it's worth bearing in mind. Include 4 key arguments with a degree of balance, and finish with a concluding argument, a clinching argument where you explain and justify your final opinion. Now we'll look at some of those example paragraphs in a moment, but you can see one there obviously. So one of the things you're going to want to do for this answer is to make a quick plan. It doesn't need to be a really quick plan. You can see here visually that I've done a plan for this answer using sort of circles, but you can just use bullet points. It's up to you how you do your plan. And I've got 2 agrees. So one of my agree arguments is going to be that local governments began to help out the poor and showed a bit more compassion. So using examples of a place like York, for example. I'm also going to use the argument of the Elizabethan Poor Law being passed in 1601 and how that brought in more support and help for the poor. And also, that's towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, so that shows that increased compassion. But I'm going to disagree, because I'm going to say, look, generally within society, there are sort of negative attitudes towards the poor, particularly towards beggars. And I'm also going to disagree, and I'm going to actually look at Elizabethan Poor Law and say that it still had quite harsh punishments towards the poor as part of the actual law itself. And then I'm going to finish with a clinching argument. So this slide just shows you an example answer for this question, and we won't read it all, but if we just have a look at the first degree, you start off, there was a lot of evidence to support this interpretation. Firstly, in the 1580s, local governments in towns such as York, Ipswich and Norwich introduced schemes for dealing with poverty. For example, York's gentry paid a poor rate to help the poor. A provision was made to pay people to work in their own homes. So you've got some specific knowledge there. Got a good link then back to the question. This can be viewed as compassionate because it shows the concern that local communities had for poorer citizens. And probably like in a real thing, you're going to flesh that out with a few more specific examples of local government action, and how towns like York, for example, divided people up into things like the deserving poor and things like that. But that's broadly the approach that you are going to take. So you need to have those 4 key arguments packed with good knowledge and evidence, and then it's about using that knowledge to actually answer the question. So using those phrases like, this shows therefore that Elizabethans did have a compassionate view because, and that's how you're really explaining your opinion. Now, looking at the clinching argument that you're going to have a look at, okay, so we've got the question there. So there's some phrases here, some good historical language for a clinching argument. So starting off using phrases like in the final analysis, in conclusion, overall, I would strongly agree, disagree, etc. And then it's good to kind of like try and embrace complexity within your answer. So you might say things like, despite the fact that, or admittedly, although some historians may argue. So what you do know in your conclusion, you've shown recognition for alternative points of view, but actually you still got your strong point of view. And then there's some phrases there to explain your final opinion. So if you look at an example clinching argument, this would be a really, really good one. And actually, a top tip here, using some of these ideas within your main essay will really help you just develop your arguments generally and your good quality of writing and your explanation skills. So we'll just read this example clinching argument. In the final analysis, I would agree that given the standards, values and attitudes of the time, that Elizabethan views towards the poor were compassionate towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. Despite the fact that there were still harsh punishments towards beggars under the 1601 Poor Law, there is no doubt there had been a shift in attitudes as exemplified by recognition that poverty was not always someone's fault. Ultimately, there was a fundamental shift and a recognition that not all of England's poor were idle, that the government needed to take more responsibility to deal with the problem of poverty. So that starts off the answer really well, embraces that complexity by recognising that even though there were harsh punishments, and explains your final opinion. And what's really good about this conclusion is that it's looking at it from the standards and values of the time. So obviously, we probably wouldn't say the Elizabethan approach to the poor is compassionate by today's standards, but actually thinking about what attitude had been like towards the poor in Elizabethan times, lots of progress had been made, and therefore we can definitely justify our opinion that Elizabethan views had become more compassionate, which is what the question is asking. So I hope you found that useful. 3 takeaways. Make sure you decode the question carefully, got your 4 key arguments for degree of balance, and make sure you make those clear links back to the question so you fully answer the question.